History, as you know, is generally dictated by the victor. Let's take a look at the Chinese Communist Party's view of the Korean War, in particular the Chosin Reservoir. Communist Chinese government-sponsored war movie that celebrates how roughly 120,000 communist troops were unable to destroy a vastly smaller force of U.S., Brits, and South Korean service members, has become China's highest-grossing film ever. The Battle of Lake Changjin has become the Communist Party's answer to John Wayne movies.
Where are they? One order. Let's go get them.
So China gets involved in the Korean War after the North Korean communists get pushed back by the Allies. Then China, as a proxy for Russia, sends hundreds of thousands of troops in to support the communist North Koreans. Let's keep going. In an effort to stoke patriotism like Hollywood has done in America for decades, the movie is loosely based on the Battle of the Chosen Reservoir. In U.S. military history, the battle for the frozen Chosen is remembered as a titanic struggle fought in the brutal cold mountain terrain, as described by Major General Oliver P. Smith, commander of the 1st Marine Division. From November 27th to December 13th, 1950, about 30,000 U.S. and Allied troops withstood the onslaught of 12 Chinese divisions and then conduct a fighting retreat to the south. So this film by the Chinese already grossed almost $900 million. So what are they celebrating? There was 120,000 Chinese troops that came down to the Chosen Reservoir to deal with 30,000 allies. In a moment, we'll get to how the Chosen Reservoir is important in the geopolitical elements of this conflict. Question for you, do you see this as an L or a W for the Chinese? The onslaught of 12 Chinese divisions and then conduct a fighting retreat to the south. The escape was a harrowing one, as quoted by General Smith. Retreat? Heck, we're not retreating, we're advancing in different directions.
My enlisted casualties were 57%. My officer casualties 72%. And I am very proud of it. But any operation I've been in, my officer casualties have exceeded the enlisted casualties by a considerable amount. I don't think that was due to my poor leadership, but it proves that all Marine officers were doing their duty.
Brief history lesson, 1945. Korea got split in two by the Russians and the Allies. Before that, the Japanese controlled it. Hence the reason you have North Korea communist, South Korea democratic.
There weren't enough trucks for the 1st Marines to move everything that they had to move, and Puller ordered his supply officer to focus on tents and stoves first and worry about ammunition later. And he said, "I'll take care of my men first. Frozen troops can't fight. If we run out of ammunition, we'll go to the bayonet." That was good advice that the Chinese could have used after they attacked, because they didn't worry about their men, and the Marines defeated them in part because so many of the Chinese froze to death.
So the real crux of the movie is depicting how the Chinese fended off communist China in North Korea from the evil of democracy. For those of you who don't know, that was Chesty Puller, a very predominant Marine officer in the Battle for the Chosen Reservoir. The Battle of the Chosen Reservoir portrays the Chinese People Voluntary Army as underdogs in a David and Goliath struggle against the mightiest military in the world, led by General MacArthur. The Chinese Communist take is that it was a major defeat for the U.S. military. The reality is a tad more nuanced. Despite taking heavy casualties, American troops and their allies survived the Chinese onslaught. Now, the Korean War began because the North Koreans invaded the South. The Allies come, push back the North Korean communists. So enter China, from Russian encouragement, pushing back the Allies before they lost any ground. Somewhat the beginning of the Cold War, and were able to save South Korea from being absorbed by the Communist Party. Survivals of the battle have been known as the Chosen Few. Parents of the current North Korean president were among the refugees who escaped. South Korean president, not North Korean, I apologize. In 1950, for the U.S. Marine Corps in particular, the Battle of the Chosen Reservoir, or the Frozen Chosen, is one that all Marines learned about in boot camp. Now, if you watch this movie, it's a Private Ryan meets Flags of Our Fathers type of thing. Very pro-China, as you expect. One man's freedom fighters, another man's terrorists. You get the point? Commandant of the Marine Corps in 1956 wrote, "The ability of Marines to fight their way through 12 Chinese divisions over a 78-mile mountain road in sub-zero weather cannot be explained by courage and endurance alone. It is also owed to a high degree of professional forethought and skill, as well as uncommon valor expected of all Marines." Chinese take this as not only a moral victory, but they pushed out the Allies, the Americans primarily. They also maintained their surf class in North Korea. By the end of the battle, 718 Marines had been killed, and another 192 were missing. 385 Marines had been wounded in action, and 7,338 were listed as non-combat casualties, which include frostbite, indigestion, and battle fatigue. If you ever get a chance, look at the Tootsie Roll drop. Who says you can't live on candy alone? A less well-known but equally important are the sacrifices U.S. soldiers made during the Battle of the Chosen Reservoir. The 31st Regimental Combat Team, known as Task Force McLean and later Task Force Faith, blocked the Chinese advance for 5 days on the eastern side of the reservoir, allowing for Marines to withdraw. When the battle began, the unit had around 3,200 troops, including roughly 700 South Korean soldiers. During the withdrawal to the south, the Chinese ambushed the task force and massacred wounded soldiers. Now, during the battle at the Chosen Reservoir, happened to be atypically cold, so many of the troops died of the elements, to include the Chinese. The reporting on how many Chinese died from not having proper gear and food, hard to find. However, the temperatures were sub-zero for most of the battle. A little more than 1,000 survivors eventually made it to their friendly lines, of which 385 were still able to fight. In light of what actually happened, the Battle of the Chosen Reservoir appears to be a hollow and cynical attempt to rewrite history, showing just how much China has learned from Hollywood. This is somewhat a new genre for China. A patriotic film about warfare and combat. Most Chinese today don't even know a thing about the Korean War, so they watch this, they get fired up. Like when Americans went to see Private Ryan. What do you think this means going forward? Does it mean anything? Is it just for entertainment? Or is it communist Hollywood just making a buck?